Okay, so we've spent a lot of time this chapter already talking about how we get different species, right? How we go from one species, evolution happens, and now we have many different species out there. Okay, so the last chunk of this chapter is going to focus on how we identify those and how we classify those, because we as humans like classifying things. We like to be able to look at something and put it in a category. It helps us make sense of things, it helps us remember things, and so we want to do that with organisms as well. And we also want to have a way to do it scientifically so that I, as a scientist in America, can talk about an organism, and someone as a scientist in Germany or in South Africa or in Australia all know that we're talking about the same exact organism. So we're going to start with scientific names. Okay. So when we talk about naming and classifying organisms, the scientific name for that system is called taxonomy. So whenever we're dealing with taxonomy, we're trying to put things into categories, give them names, give them classifications. And again, this is because if I discover an organism, I can name it, right? Well, if I discover something here, and somebody, even across the state of North Dakota, if we're talking, a long time ago, across the state, somebody could discover that same species and name it something, so we can both talk about it with our own names for it. We'll probably think we're talking about different things, it's talking about the same thing, we don't really know. Okay? So they kind of discovered that we wanted to have some kind of standardization for naming organisms, okay? Just like we all want to use the same measurements when we talk about we use the metric system because all scientists want to use the same measurements, we all want to use the same names. So the idea of scientific names came up a long time ago, but some of those names for species got really, really long and it was difficult to make them all the same. And so in the 1730s, Carolus Linnaeus developed a system that we still use today, and that's called binomial nomenclature. Okay? Or you'll sometimes hear it as like Linnaean classification, obviously based after his last name. And this is what we still use today to make scientific names for organisms. And so binomial, bi means two, and nomial would be like the name part of it. So it's two names, basically, is what it means. So every species gets assigned a two-part name. And it's all based on Latin. And there's some rules that we follow. So the first rule is that they're always written in italics. Okay, that's really important. If you're going to write the scientific name, it has to be in italics. Now, obviously, when you are writing things and your notes are on a worksheet or on a test, you can't write in italics. So you underline. That's how you show that something would be italicized, is underline it. So that means if I ask you to write a scientific name on your test or anything or on an assignment, it needs to be underlined because it needs to be italicized. Our second rule is that the first word is always going to begin with a capital letter. Okay? Always. It's a name, right? Just like you write your name with a capital letter, hopefully, you need to write their scientific names with a capital letter. But the second word, okay, so it's two words, the first word is capitalized, the second word is always lowercase. So only the first word, the second word is always lowercased. And so how we go about doing this, the first part of that name is always going to be the genus, and we'll talk about those organization system here in a little bit. Okay, but the first word is the genus. The second word is something that is descriptive, either describes a trait of the organism or something about the organism's habitat, but that's what specifies the species, and they try and make it, again, somewhat descriptive so that it makes sense. If you know Latin, if you know Latin roots and things like that, it should make somewhat sense. So an example of a scientific name in binomial nomenclature for llamas, you can see at the bottom there, is llama glama. So again, llama, this is all italicized, llama is capitalized, glama is not. This would be the genus, they're part of the genus Llama, and then the species for that would be Glama. Okay, so that is our scientific names. Okay, so still with Linnaean classification, again, this is still Linnaeus. He did a lot of work with taxonomy. And so not only did he develop our system for that binomial nomenclature where we give organisms their scientific names, but he also developed a classification system for all species and organized them into what we call taxa. And so today we've expanded that. I don't remember exactly how many taxa he had when he started, but we now have 7 taxa, and they go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So if you look at this, kingdom would be the biggest, so that's like the largest group or the broadest group, and they just start getting a little bit more specialized and specific. Okay, phylum, then class, then order, then family, then genus, and then species. And so if you're that scientific name that we just talked about, genus is the first word, and then that species would be the second word. These, you guys, you're going to want to remember them in order. The little saying that I was always taught growing up that has somehow stuck in my mind was King Philip came over for good spaghetti. So it's Kingdom Philip came over for good spaghetti. But whatever you need to do to remember it, but you are going to want to remember all 7 of those in order. So just a little bit about some of these. When we talk about kingdoms, during Linnaeus' time, they only thought there was 2 kingdoms. So they had Animalia and Plantae, which hopefully you can tell, animals and plants, because that's all the organisms they knew about. We didn't know about things like bacteria or other little microscopic organisms that they probably didn't even know exist, and B, they didn't know enough about them to be able to classify them anywhere. Okay, so we only had 2 kingdoms back then. It was either plants or animals. So this is kind of how this works. So again, kingdom, if we're looking at the kingdom Animalia, we can have all these organisms that are part of that kingdom. Okay, the phylum is Chordata, and that means that they have a backbone. Okay, so then that's excludes, that little sea star over there. Okay, then we get to our class, which is Mammalia, obviously mammals. So again, that got rid of that snake. The class narrows it down more, the class is Mammalia. The order, Carnivora, narrows it down a little bit more. Those are carnivores. Okay, family, Ursidae. That's related to bears. Okay, our genus is Ursus. And then the species would be just that grizzly bear that we're looking at. And its scientific name is Ursus arctos. Okay, so each one gets a little bit more specific, and again, that scientific name took the genus name, and then arctos is just for that grizzly bear. So, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So like we said, we started out with just 2 kingdoms. But as we learn more, as we discover new organisms, as we do other things, scientists found a lot of organisms that didn't fit into either being a plant or an animal. So now we actually have 6 kingdoms. We have eubacteria, archaeobacteria, protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So eubacteria, archaeobacteria, those are both prokaryotes. Those are all of our bacterias. Okay, so that's those 2. All the rest of these would be eukaryotes. Protists, we'll learn about protists next chapter. Fungi, we'll talk about next chapter. And then obviously plants and animals as well. And actually, there's more of these bacteria organisms than there are of any of these other kingdoms. But again, when we started classifying things, what can we see? Well, for the most part, we can see plants and animals. Obviously, fungi like mushrooms and things you can see too, but they were probably classified as plants before we really knew more about their structure. And so 6 kingdoms is kind of a lot. And so scientists now have actually added another taxonomic category just to kind of narrow things down even more. So we don't have to jump right to that kingdom. We can start with what we call a domain. So a domain would be larger than a kingdom, and we have 3 domains where we go bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So the bacteria domain is just this eubacteria kingdom. The archaea domain is just the archaea bacteria kingdom. So each of these bacteria kingdoms get their own domain, and then all the rest of these 4 kingdoms all get put into that eukarya because they're all eukaryotes. And again, that's because there's so much diversity in each of these bacteria kingdoms that they basically warrant their own domain. And then again, eukarya, all the eukaryotes, we can put them all together. And so this is just kind of shows how we have changed classification over the years. Again, with Linnaeus, we had 2 kingdoms, vegetables, animals, okay, or plantae animals. So again, plants and animals. Then we added, about 130 years later, we added in protists, which would have been small. You wouldn't be able to see them, right? Microscopic organisms. Then we actually went back and we just called 2 empires. So we just did prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Then as we get to know more about it, we're back to plants, animals, protists, Monera. We went to 5 kingdoms, where you can see those bacteria are all still together, but we have the other 4. Then we went up to 6 kingdoms, and then now we've decided to go with 3 domains, and we still have those 6 kingdoms. And so there's a lot of similarities, but again, basically we just added more throughout the years as we learned more about their structure and the differences between them. Okay, and so again, really this classification piece is the last part of this chapter. So this is what we're going to focus on, looking at how we classify things, looking at how we name things, and all that kind of stuff.